Director of the Neponset River Watershed Association. So this is an overview of the Neponset River Watershed. So as I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Neponset River Watershed Association, which is a private nonprofit group. We were founded in 1968, and our mission is to clean up and protect the Neponset River and its watershed. And the watershed is basically just the area of land that ultimately drains into the river. So, when you look out your door in Mattapan or Hyde Park or Dorchester, the water that is going by the shore there has come all the way from Foxborough, Stoughton, Sharon, Walpole, collected through little tributaries and lakes and ponds and so forth to make its way down to you. The watershed is about 120 square miles. The river itself is about 30 miles long. And it's not we're not in the outer country here. About 330,000 people live in the Neponset watershed, and about 120,000 people get their drinking water from sources in the Neponset watershed. And certainly, the river is beautiful. It has come a long, long way over the years in terms of being cleaned up, but it does certainly still face any number of challenges. So as I mentioned, the Watershed Association is a nonprofit group. This is a little bit of an outdated picture, but this is our staff and a couple interns. So we actually have 9 staff now, about 8 full-time equivalents. The organization does lots of different kinds of work, all focused on cleaning up and protecting the watershed. And we get our support from individual members, business supporters, a little bit from foundations, a little bit from grants here and there. And somehow we have managed to cobble our budget together and keep things going every year. This is what I think of as the lower Neponset River. So I don't know how, hopefully you can see this map pretty well. But basically the river is coming in from upstream. It's coming on the left side of your screen where it's a little skinny through Hyde Park. And I think you can, hopefully you can see my little mouse pointer there. Can people see my mouse pointer? All right, so right down here is right on the Hyde Park, almost Mattapan line near the Tileston and Hollingsworth Dam by the Price Right supermarket. As we come downstream, Truman Highway is along this area. This is Blue Hill Avenue, Mattapan Square. Here we come down to Ryan Playground and the so-called Rice Islands and the Harvest River Bridge, which is right about here. Making our way a little further downstream, you get to Lower Mills at the Baker Dam at Lower Mills. And then downstream of Lower Mills, the river really changes. So upstream of Lower Mills, where it's skinny on the map, it's all freshwater. And downstream of Lower Mills, it's a mix of freshwater and saltwater. So you can see the river gets much wider as it spreads out into the marshes. And then we come around to Granite Avenue. Lots of parkland along the river, lots of very valuable wildlife habitat. Here's the highway, here's Pope John Paul Park. Then we come around and we've got Port Norfolk, Kenyon Beach, and of course the end of the river is right at the Boston gas tank, kind of a line from the gas tank across to Squantum Point and Quincy. And after that, it becomes Dorchester Bay. So that's where we're at. And of course, there's lots of valuable resources along the lower Neponset. Of course, the salt marshes, which are very scenic, but also a wonderful wildlife habitat and help to manage storm damage. Great place to go fishing on the Neponset River, lots of fishing activity, lots of even non-human fisher people. Well, I guess he's not a fisher person, but lots of non-humans fishing in the estuary, incredible wildlife. Whoops. A really wonderful history around chocolate making and other early industries that drew people to our area and really shaped the river that we see today. Of course, the beautiful Greenway, which has really transformed the community's relationship to the Neponset River. The Neponset River used to be very hard to get to. You kind of had to really work. You probably had to climb some fences to get there. And now every day, thousands of people, because of the greenway, are able to get out and enjoy the river every day. And other kinds of uses, boating, rowing is a really nice activity to see out on the Neponset. And even swimming. You know, people don't think a lot about swimming in the Neponset River, but there are places where you can, and this is, of course, Tenian Beach. One of the big questions we get about the river is, is it clean, and how is it coming in terms of getting it cleaned up? One of the things we do is we monitor water quality 6 times a year in the freshwater part of the river. So that's upstream of Adam Street. And we do that using a team of about 40 volunteers at 41 different locations across the watershed. This young man is actually part of a vocational training program for young people who are training for jobs in the water industry. And he is in the midst of taking a water quality sample. Those samples come back. Some of them get processed in our lab, but many of them get processed by the laboratory at the Mass Water Resources Authority. Um, and in terms of how clean the river is, so we have 3 locations that we sample in the sort of Hyde Park, Mattapan, Dorchester area. The first is at, it's actually shown listed here as Blue Hills Parkway. It's probably more accurate to say Blue Hill Avenue, just upstream of Mattapan Square. And you can see about in the last 3 years, the water meets swimmable water quality standards about 2/3 of the time. As you move downstream to Ryan Playground, um, that drops to about 40% of the time that the river meets swimmable standards, and most of the rest of the time it's meeting boatable standards. When you get down to Adam Street, it's actually recovered a little bit. It's up to 56% of the time that it's meeting those swimmable standards. There's a couple of reasons why those not, obviously we would the Clean Water Act says that all of the river is supposed to have a completely green circle there, 100% meeting swimmable standards. That doesn't happen in practice, and there's a couple reasons for that. Oops, come on. One big one is things like this. This is a storm drain outfall. This is actually one in Hyde Park. And if you can see this sort of gray water coming out of it, you know there's a problem here. So two things. Storm drains collect rainwater runoff from streets and bring it to the river. When it's not raining, nothing should be coming out of them. But of course, here it's a sunny day and water's coming out. And you can see that water is rather gray. This is what we call an illicit connection or an illicit discharge. And basically, Boston has old plumbing, and there are a lot of places where still, even now, sewage manages to get out of the sewer system and into the drain system, and the drains take it to the river. This is a problem the city has been working on very diligently for a long time. I'll be totally candid. I wish it's a very painstaking process that is not getting squared away as quickly as I would like, not for lack of effort on the city's part, but it's a frustratingly slow process. Last year, I think they found and eliminated 2 more illicit discharges, but there still are pipes that are bringing sewage to the river even on a sunny day. The other big factor with water quality on the Neponset is the contrast between these 2 graphs. On the left, this is the water quality at Lower Mills when the weather is dry. So when it's not raining, 80% of the time swimmable at Lower Mills when it's not raining. On the right is the graph when it is raining. Only 25% swimmable when it is raining. So when it's raining, properly functioning storm drains collect water from the street and they bring it to the river for disposal. Unfortunately, we have older infrastructure here, and that infrastructure doesn't include modern devices that would intercept and clean up that water before it gets discharged. So basically, any sort of material left on the street is going to end up in the river. And when you think about how big the city is, this is actually a map of storm drain pipes. And the little arrows are showing you the green is the storm drain pipes, Little arrows are showing the direction that the storm drainage flows. So basically, any place you see one of those iron catch basin grates in the city, that water is getting to a river somewhere, either the Charles or the Neponset or directly into the harbor. And even if you are quite a distance, even miles away from the river, there is a man-made infrastructure that's taking that and any pollution that's in it and bringing it out into the environment. So dealing with that, both from an education standpoint to try to help get people to not pollute on the streets, not put dog poop bags, for example, or oil down catch basins is a big challenge. And then in the longer term, trying to retrofit our infrastructure with devices to help intercept and clean up that water before it gets to the river. It's a huge challenge. And this is just what one of those discharge points looks like. This is a storm drain outfall. This is in Hyde Park, and we gave it the little artistic effect here. Um, that's water quality. The next thing I'm going to talk about is a project we've been working on for more than 20 years now, which is an effort to try to bring herring and shad back up the Neponset River. So this young man is holding a shad. He is unfortunately not anywhere near the Neponset. He's, I think, in New York somewhere. And shad and herring are very similar fish, except one's a lot smaller than the other. The shads are the big ones. And these fish used to come up the river by the at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions, um, in when the colonists were here. They were a major source of food, fertilizer, a major source of food for the Native Americans who originally occupied this area. And for many years now, probably 200 or more years now, they have been excluded from being able to come up the river to spawn like they naturally would by dams. Um, so one of the things we are working to do is try to restore fish passage past the dams. There are two dams in particular that are a challenge for herring and shad on the Neponset. One is the Baker Dam. This is the Baker Dam right in Lower Mills. The other you may not have seen is another artistic picture of a not very attractive structure. The other is the so-called Tileston and Hollingsworth Dam, which is in Hyde Park, near the Hyde Park Mattapan line, behind the Price Right Shopping Center off of River Street, if you know where that is. These two dams, which are now about both owned by the state now, are actually blocking fish from accessing 17 miles, 17 out of 30 miles of the Neponset River. This map sort of shows, you can see down at the downstream end, here's the Baker Dam, here's the TNH Dam, and the next barrier on the main stem Neponset is all the way up here in Walpole. So all of these areas that are shown as red, if the fish could get past those two dams, they would be able to reach all of those streams and river miles. They would be there. There have been habitat assessments, so we know they would be very happy to do it. And in fact, the Neponset is one of only 5 rivers that had American shad when the colonists arrived, and it's the in Massachusetts, and it's the only one that still has a significant restoration opportunity. So ecologically, sort of culturally, historically, a really big restoration opportunity here. Uh, One of the things that has come up as we've been studying this for many years is we discovered that the Neponset has a challenge, not surprisingly, has a challenge with its mud. And perhaps the thing that is actually most surprising about the mud on the Neponset is that it's actually pretty clean if you compare it to the mud at the bottom of the Charles or the bottom of the Mystic River. In most ways, our sediment is pretty clean. It doesn't has relatively little lead and other kinds of heavy metals. But we do have a very specific problem with what are called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, which were a synthetic chemical that was a hugely useful chemical for all kinds of industrial purposes, but is a suspected carcinogen, creates a number of other health problems, and was banned in the 70s. And the fact that we had PCBs in the river was discovered as part of studying what to do about the Baker Dam and the TNH Dam. Um, so, and basically what we have, it's interesting that, the PCBs were a very common chemical. They were used in lots and lots of places. Um, but on the Neponset, the only place you find them in really high concentrations is downstream of Mother Brook. So just to orient people, so over here you've got the Baker Dam, here you've got the Tileston and Hollingsworth Dam, and then this is Mother Brook coming in. Mother Brook is actually a canal that drains out of the Charles and into the Neponset. And historically, there were a series of companies along Mother Brook who used PCBs and were known to discharge them into the Neponset River and were held responsible by enforcement authorities for those discharges and have actually done quite a nice job of cleaning up Mother Brook. But they insisted that when, their PCBs got to the end of Mother Brook, they just suddenly stopped. They didn't keep flowing downstream. And in fact, we know that that's not true. And in fact, today we have PCBs in the mud along the river, particularly behind the Tileston and Hollingsworth Dam, and to a lesser degree in the so-called braided channel, or sometimes people refer to it as the Rice Islands, which is just downstream of the Harvest River Purple Pedestrian Bridge, and also behind the Baker Impoundment. The highest concentrations are up near the TNH Dam, with lower but still significant concentrations down further downstream. One of the things that we always tell people about this is, so shortly after this happened, the state did some pretty thorough examination of areas on the land where they thought there could be PCBs, particularly in parks. This happens to be Kennedy Playground and Edgewater Drive, some of the assessment they did. And so they checked basically any place they thought people on land or at a canoe launch might actually come into interaction with PCBs. And generally they found nothing or nearly nothing. So the standard for PCBs is 2 parts per million. And as you can see, they were well below that here at Kennedy. And in fact, there were no land locations where they found elevated levels of PCBs. So we have PCBs, but they're in the river. They're not jumping out of the river. So long as you don't eat the fish, which is something we definitely don't recommend, eating fish from this section of the river, there's relatively minimal human risk, but there is definitely significant ecological risk. And it's just not a great thing to have the PCBs in there. So the next step with the PCBs, unfortunately, the situation with the PCBs has really been a barrier to moving forward with dealing with the dams for a bunch of complicated bureaucratic and legal reasons that I won't get into. Really, the PCBs have to be dealt with first. And DEP has spent a long time looking at the companies that we think put this material here, and about a year and a half ago concluded that they didn't have the ability to take enforcement action for this problem, and they referred the issue to EPA. So EPA, under what's commonly known as the Superfund program, has much more significant resources and enforcement ability than the state DEP does. So EPA has been looking at the Neponset for a couple of years now. They've done their own sampling of PCBs. They've been doing their own historical research about who's used PCBs along the Neponset River. It was probably a year ago, they did a little bit of public outreach, and they're gearing up to basically nominate the Neponset for what's called the National Priority List, essentially putting it on their list of sites that they're actively working to get cleaned up. That was delayed because of the pandemic. They were supposed to submit that this fall, and they're not going to. Hopefully that will get submitted during 2021, which will start the process of getting these PCBs, getting responsible parties held responsible for this, and getting some cleanup of the sediment. To be totally honest, that is going to be a long process, likely measured in years, if not decades, to get that finished. Unfortunately, we're going to be pushing it along, but it's not something that happens fast. The next thing I just want to mention, of course, is the Greenway itself. You know, the Greenway is an incredible resource. Everybody knows the Harvest River Bridge. Um, and one thing I really want to encourage people to do is to get involved with the Neponset River Greenway Council. Our organization, the Neponset River Greenway Council, really came out of some early work that was started by the Boston Natural Areas Network, which is a nonprofit that really was the driver for a lot of the investment and improvements in along the Neponset Greenway that the state has made over the years. Unfortunately, that organization, Boston Natural Areas Network, is no longer with us. And it's really the absence of a staffed nonprofit that's really focused on the unique open space and parkland management issues along the Neponset River has really been a challenge and a weakness for the Neponset since BNAN has been gone. The Greenway Council is a volunteer committee and that is focused on doing advocacy around the Greenway. And in the last couple of years, our organization has decided to, what we've sort of seen this as such a critical problem that we've decided to commit some staff time to help support the Greenway Council, to help them be more effective in advocating for completing the incomplete sections of the Greenway and maintaining and improving the rest of the route. So the council, we've been working with them for about a year, and the council is doing some great work. They've put together a new strategic plan for themselves. They're getting geared up to try to do some outreach, although certainly more public outreach, although certainly the pandemic has not been helping with that. But this is a great organization. If you're really interested in the management of the Greenway and trying to finish the unfinished parts of the Greenway, I definitely encourage you to check these guys out and get involved in their meetings. They meet once a month over Zoom for now. And just to put this in context, you know, this is DCR's map of the Neponset Greenway as they see it from a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of infrastructure here. There's miles of trail, there's numerous parks, and in many other waters. So for example, if you go to the lower Charles River, you'll find there's like 3 or 4 staffed nonprofit organizations all trying to protect and improve those parklands. And I think the reason we need a strong local advocate for the parklands is to make sure that the Neponset gets the attention it needs. There's still a lot of work unfinished from the Neponset Greenway, not least of which is the connection between Tenian Beach and Morrissey Boulevard. That's the connection to the rest of Boston. At the other end, the trail right now really dead ends at the end of Truman Highway. And there's connections to be made upstream to the Blue Hills, potentially beyond the Blue Hills along the Truman Parkway. And then along the route, there are a number of really important places that have just sort of unfinished business around access to the river. Some of the most severe cases for that, I think, are in Mattapan and parts of Hyde Park, along Edgewater Drive, Doyle Playground. Those are things that we as the Watershed Association are really trying to help focus on helping those neighborhoods get access to the river since they weren't part of the infrastructure that's been built so far. One other unfortunate, this is our annual Neponset River Fest, which is an event we had started pre-pandemic. It of course was canceled this year. It's been a great way, we think, to bring people out, to get people out in canoes, enjoying the river. A lot of huge smiles on faces from people who've obviously never been in a canoe before, or actually been on the Neponset River. And that's, you know, what we love to see. We hope, it seems doubtful that we will actually be able to do this this coming spring, but in 2022, definitely look for River Fest again. And this happens at Neponset 2 Park down by Granite Ave. And we're also trying to think about, in the meantime, what other kinds of outreach can we work with the Greenway Council and others to do on a smaller scale in the meantime. And this is, I love this picture of the people being photographed while taking a picture of the other people who are taking a photograph. Another big challenge on the Neponset is just trash. You know, we have opened up this section of the lower Neponset that has been essentially isolated and inaccessible for decades. And not surprisingly, a lot of stuff was left behind. So a big focus for us the last couple of years has been simply trying to get the trash out of the river and out of parks along the river. Um, this year we had, in the spring, we had to cancel our cleanup. This is an all volunteer event. This fall, we were able to do it in a socially distanced fashion, and I'm excited to say we actually did more locations. I think we had 14 locations, and we had a huge number of volunteers. I think almost 300 volunteers, which is the most we've ever had. And in 2 hours, they were able to collect about 10 tons of junk, including about 100 tires for the river. So there's still more to do here. I think this is just a great, simple, very satisfying, very dirty way to get out and help make our park center greenway just a little nicer and a little more enjoyable. This I don't know what happened to this picture, but these folks are at Pope John Paul Park. And then the last thing I just want to mention, which is a huge challenge for the Lower Neponset right now and in the coming years, is climate change. This is a photograph of Milton Landing from early 2018. I don't know if you remember, we had that sort of winter storm that was happened on a lunar high tide and it had a tidal surge. If you're familiar with Milton Landing, this is not what it's supposed to look like. You can see the railing there, which I believe is a 4 foot high railing, which is 3 feet underwater. The park off to the right, you can't even see the boats. They almost look like they're floating, but they're supposed to be parked in the parking lot. Sea level rise is a huge challenge for neighborhoods along the Neponset. Um, this is just another shot. This is at Granite Ave looking towards the Butler Tea Stop in that same storm event. Not a great place to sit right now. That's the Greenway right in front of us. And then one last picture. This is at Neponset 2 Park, looking upstream towards Butler Tea Station again with the drawbridge on the right. And you can see Neponset 2 Park is inundated as well. And this picture was actually below the peak of the height of the water. Um, the city of Boston has actually been taking this issue pretty seriously, and I think they are farther along in thinking about these issues than pretty much any other community in Massachusetts right now. They just released last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, their so-called Climate Ready Dorchester report. I would definitely encourage you to go take a look at it because this is a huge issue particularly for Dorchester. This report is focused entirely on sea level rise issues, flooding related to sea level rise. It really does not address yet flooding related to rain. So this report really speaks to the area from Lower Mills downstream, that part of Dorchester. It doesn't get into the upper part of Dorchester or Mattapan, which is above the reach of the high tide, although there are big challenges there as well. We are, aside from having higher sea levels, we're also having much heavier rainstorms than we're accustomed to. And certainly that's going to cause river flooding where water runs off and then the river rises and spills over its banks. But almost a bigger problem than that is actually what we call stormwater flooding. So all those storm drains I pointed out earlier, in order for water to get out of your neighborhood, the rain has to be able to get into that storm drain and flow somewhere else. And one of the big challenges, and this is true whether you're upstream of the tide or whether you're downstream of the tide, is going to be the ability of rain to get into those drainage systems fast enough and the ability for it to drain out. As the river is higher, it's harder for the water to drain out into the river because the river is higher. And the same thing happens with sea level rise. Many of the solutions they talk about in this plan talk about elevating kind of the shoreline to try to keep water from flowing into the interior neighborhoods. There's still going to be a big challenge with what do you do with the rain that's now stuck behind that elevated shoreline. So anyway, just to show you a few highlights of this, this is probably too small to see. It's really a beautifully done report, aesthetically speaking. Uh, this is showing, and it's too small to see here, but this is showing flood elevations in 2070, which is 50 years out. Um, and I have to say, 50 years seems like a long time away, but as I've gotten a little older, I think I've got a greater appreciation that that is really not that long a time period. I mean, I have a daughter now who's a senior in high school, and this map is sort of depicting what's going to happen in her lifetime. So the assumption here that they're making is that there's going to be 40 inches of sea level rise. That's actually, by some people would now call that a pretty optimistic estimate of how much sea level rise we're going to have. But the starting point for the analysis, and the different colors on this map are showing you two things. The sort of darker blue is showing you areas that are going to be inundated once a month in 2070. So that's sort of like common, it's not quite every day, but close to everyday flooding in 2070. And then the lighter blue color is what gets inundated in the so-called 1% storm event, which is some people refer to that as the 100-year storm. And just to give you a little better sense of this, this is just a zoom in on part of it, centered on Port Norfolk. And you can see a couple things happen here. So there's, again, look at those dark blue areas, which mostly, but not completely, are park areas that are getting inundated every month. In the upper corner here, remember I showed you the picture of the Granite Ave Bridge and the flooding? You'll notice that the flooding in the picture I showed a few minutes ago is almost the same extent as what they're saying is going to be every month, 50 years. So a big change. And then the other thing that happens is during the 1% storm event, what happens is there are certain low points along the perimeter of the city where water starts to come in. So here, the 3A bridge is one of those low points. So when the water gets really high, it starts to come up from the river through the 3A bridge and circulates back here. Pine Neck Creek at the end of Tenian Beach is another one. Water comes up and starts getting back into the neighborhoods here. And actually the far side of Malibu Beach is another one. Water comes under the bridge and goes around here and starts getting into the neighborhood. And of course, Port Norfolk is really, really facing some challenges. So this report tries to lay out solutions for some of those problems. This is a little hard to see at this scale, but one of the possible solutions, this is what they're proposing at the 3A bridge. And here they've taken a pretty ambitious approach. As you can see, there's actually buildings that aren't here anymore in these sketches. So they've tried to reclaim some land along the edge of the river, to raise the edge to keep the water out, and to create essentially new marshes and recreation area to help try to absorb that flood water. We think that's a pretty thoughtful approach to doing this, but it's clearly a very ambitious plan. One other thing that is really notable about the Climate Ready Dorchester plan is that this is a city laid out, this is a vision laid out by the city without any consultation with the state. And 90% of the land they're talking about here is state land. So there's huge kind of institutional challenges to making these kinds of changes, as well as just sort of engineering challenges. And of course, this is expensive. I think the cost estimate for just the Dorchester part of this is 110 to 200 and some $million. And there's similarly expensive investments called for to protect downtown Boston, which I think was closer to $500 million, and the North End and Charlestown and East Boston. So just a tremendous challenge for the city, for residents of the city, and for all of our institutions. So I definitely encourage you to go check this out, to think about it, and to be involved in advocating for the city to continue being proactive about these issues, because they are really, really challenging issues. And if you want to find this plan, you can, if you just Google climate ready Dorchester. It'll come right up. So that's my story. That's my update on the Lower Neponset, how we're doing, and what some of our remaining challenges are. I just we'll open things up and go to some questions. But I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. Remind folks that we are a very much a grassroots nonprofit. We survive and are effective because of volunteers, because of members, and we definitely hope that you will get engaged with us and with the river and with your community. So with that, I will turn this off. And if people have questions and want to unmute themselves, or we may have, looks like we've got some questions in the chat that people have put in.
Ian, I can read you the questions if you'd like to make it easier.
That'd be great.
And folks, if you joined a little bit after Ian's introduction, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we have time, we'll get to them. So the first question came from Peter Jackson, and he was curious if there were PCB contributors on the main stem branch below Mother Brook.
Below Mother Brook, there potentially are. There's one site in particular known as Lewis Chemical, which is a known site with PCBs. Although, you know, when they first started studying this problem, they actually did some pretty innovative monitoring work, which was done by the USGS to try to quote unquote fingerprint the PCBs. PCBs are complicated chemicals. They're actually a combination of 209 different molecules, and you can sort of see how much of molecule number 172 versus number 3 there is. And the sense they came away with was that the majority of the material came out of Mother Brook, but that doesn't eliminate other potential sources. In fact, the DEP in its research identified, I think, 77 known PCB release sources, sites across the Neponset watershed, including a big Superfund site up in Norwood, the Grant Gear site, which has since been remediated. But, you know, if you look at the levels in the river upstream of Mother Brook versus, you know, in Mother Brook itself, and the fingerprints of those, they really point strongly to the sites on Mother Brook as the primary source.
Thank you. Peter was also curious, has Quincy become a partner in efforts for the river?
They have. You know, we have, I mean, not, you know, everybody can be a better partner, certainly, but Quincy has done some good things. You know, we worked with Pete, actually, and Quincy to create the Quincy River Walk. We have actually been working a lot with Quincy on stormwater issues lately, which has been a really positive development. We really have quite a strong working relationship with their DPW now. We actually have Quincy. There's a puddle on the Quincy River Walk, and the Quincy River Walk is essentially a trail from Route 3A to Squantum Point. That's river access along the river that was developed basically by negotiating with developers as they were redeveloping along that section of the river that we were very involved in. So there's actually a puddle on the Riverwalk, and interestingly, somebody in the mayor's office, whenever somebody calls to complain to the mayor about the puddle, the mayor's office calls us and says, "Hey, let's work on the puddle." So one thing Andres is working on is getting the puddle fixed. And actually, one very positive development from Quincy recently was there's been a parcel of land in Quincy, which is kind of right on the Milton-Quincy border, kind of between the President's Golf Course and the State Street South development, which has always been sort of flagged as something that ought to be acquired. It's a very low-lying, marshy area, extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. And there was a recent development proposal that came forward to develop that, and the city was quite proactive. They took advantage of the Community Preservation Act, which they enacted a few years ago, and they're on track to actually buy that and keep it in its natural state. So certainly, I think a more constructive relationship with Quincy than we had many years ago.
Nice. Paul Lauenstein asks that you mentioned PCBs as an obstacle to dam removal, so the shad can come back to the Neponset River. What about PFAS?
Interesting question. I have no idea. I don't think anybody has tested sediment in the Neponset River for PFAS. I'm sure it's there because I think it's pretty much everywhere, but uh, I really don't know the answer to your question.
All right. And Paul actually has a follow-up question also related to dam removal, which asks, would the proposed modification of the Baker Dam accommodate herring and shad spawning runs?
Yes. So one of the things that we did, over the years as we've been working on the Baker and the Teenage Dam, is it's starting to be a while ago now. We had a very extensive public involvement process where we basically recruited representatives of all the various neighborhood associations and other interest groups up and down the river to talk about what ought to happen for the design of the fish passage because it was somewhat controversial. And that group met for at least a year. They had these incredible 3-hour meetings, and like everybody came to every meeting we had. Maybe it was the pizza, I don't know. But people had these just unbelievably constructive conversations from people who lived in the Baker condos and were concerned about the historic aesthetic of the dam to a guy from the Massachusetts tribe who came and spoke very eloquently about the sort of history of the fish. And it was really a testament to sort of the best of democracy in terms of citizens who might disagree with each other but still engage with each other. And that group came up with a different solution than had initially been proposed, frankly, by our organization or others. And that was to go ahead and remove the Tileston and Hollingsworth Dam, which nobody had much affection for, and instead to modify the Baker Dam. So I don't know if you remember the picture I showed of the Baker Dam. It sort of has, it's sort of divided into bays. And the plan was basically to take probably the left hand, if you're looking upstream, third of the dam and take that out and build in the pond what's called a nature-like fishway, which would be sort of like you could think of it as a handicap ramp for fish, but it's basically would be a section that would sort of gradually slope up to the elevation of the pond. So it's not a fish ladder, which is problematic for a number of reasons, but it's much more like a natural stream, but without completely removing the dam. And by the time we got through that process and checked with the engineers, like, hey, can you actually do this? We actually had unanimous agreement among the participants in the CAC in favor of that solution. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Vivian Morris wants to know what role, if any, might the current dams play in future flooding prevention?
Both of these dams and this is true of most. A lot of people have a misconception that dams prevent floods, and it's true that there are certain kinds of dams with certain designs that do help reduce floods. But there are about 100 dams in the Neponset watershed. Only 2 of them were designed as flood control dams. And the way it's actually pretty easy to recognize a flood control dam because a flood control dam, one, has no water in it unless a flood is actually occurring. So it's basically like a giant empty bathtub. So if you've ever driven cut down Unquity Road through Milton by the Yulin Rink, that thing that I like grew up not too far there. And I always wondered, like, what is this grassy hill thing on the left as you head down towards Houghton's Pond? And that's one of the 2 flood control dams. And if you go on the other side of it, there's like 100 acres of land that's just a wetland. And during a flood, that dam fills up and holds back 10 feet of water and slowly releases it. Um, the kinds of dams, the Teenage Dam and the Baker Dam, are both what are called run of river dams. So they're always full. And essentially what they become in a flood is they become an obstacle that the river has to back up behind in order for the river to get over it and continue downstream. So if those dams were removed, the water elevations in the river during a flood would be substantially lower, actually. And in fact, the reason that those dams are the way they are is because in the 50s, those dams were privately owned, and the dam owners really failed to lower the dams quick enough. So the state came in, they took the entire river by eminent domain after Hurricane Diana in 1955. There were actually, I think it was 7 dams along this stretch. The state removed 5 of them, but kept the T&H Dam and the Baker Dam. The T&H Dam is a design that's specifically designed to be very quickly and easily lowered. It's called a bascule gate dam. It's almost like a hinged door that they just kind of press a button and the whole thing folds down and it's like the dam's completely gone. The Baker Dam is a flashboard design. So the flashboards need to be taken out during a flood. And there have been several incidents since the dam was built where the, the DCR, or formerly the MDC, failed to do that quickly enough. And the dam caused water to spill over onto what's now the Greenway and run down past what's now the condo, but used to be the Hood plant, including most spectacularly a couple of years after they finished rebuilding it in, I think it was 1972. So both of these dams, frankly, from a flooding standpoint, we would be better off without them.
Great. Sarah Brooks wants to know, with sea level rise, what will happen with the salt water or freshwater delineation?
That's another really interesting question. So right now, at high tide, the river will just come up. This tide will just come up and kiss the bottom of the Baker Dam. But the Baker Dam provides a hard break on the Neponset between the freshwater part of the river and the saltwater part of the river. At low tide, below the Baker Dam for a good distance is all freshwater. But at high tide, the tide comes up to the dam. It's an interesting question. What will happen? I would expect that under sort of even with 40 inches of sea level rise, I would think in a normal kind of monthly high tide, the Baker Dam would still function as a hard break between the freshwater and the saltwater. Although I have to say, I have seen a couple of historical photos of the area between Adams Street and the Baker Dam during some past floods. And when you have the river coming down, flooding, trying to get out, and you have the storm surge coming in, the water level actually gets up, basically to the existing dam, so that it almost, in some of these pictures I've seen, it almost looks like it's continuous water level from upstream of the dam to downstream. Whether sea level rise and storm surge would mean occasionally, salt water would actually go upstream of the Baker Dam is an interesting question. It's not one that that they looked at in Climate Ready Boston.
Great. Speaking of Climate Ready Boston, earlier Nancy Filer put the link to the Climate Ready Dorchester report in the chat. So if anyone's curious and wants to get the link, it's right in there. We don't have any more questions for right now. If anyone else has any others, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself at this point and ask Ian.